Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to start by heat treating the springs that I forged in the last video. And with the springs heat treated, I'm finally going to be able to start assembling this lock mechanism. Anytime you have to put small parts in the forge, there's always a risk of losing them in the fire. So the first thing that I always do is make sure that my fire is well packed and it's solid so the bottom isn't going to fall out of it. If you have a good solid fire, what you place on top is going to stay on top. This particular job is actually quite easy because there's a mounting hole in each spring, so I'm able to wire the whole thing together and heat treat them all as a bundle. So all I need to do is carefully bury the springs in the coals. I want to have coals on all three sides, and then I give it a very light air blast, just enough to keep the fire going. I want to bring these pieces up to temperature very slowly. So I'll crank the blower a few times and then stop, let the temperature even out through all the pieces, and then I'll crank the blower some more, just to build up the heat very gradually. So at this point I've had the pieces in the fire for about 5 minutes and I'm ready to pull them out and quench them. I'm going to be quenching the springs in oil, and I'm going to leave them in the oil until they reach room temperature. I'm going to be drawing the temper to a full blue, so I have my test piece in the frying pan and I'm measuring the temperature with a heat gun. This is a really inexpensive heat gun, and I know that the actual temperature isn't going to be correct, but when I measure the temperature of the test piece, that is going to tell me what I need to maintain to get a good temper through all the pieces. So when the test piece reaches a full peacock blue color, I'm going to measure that temperature with the heat gun. Whatever that temperature reads, that's what I'm going to maintain in the frying pan. So the parts will be drawn to that temper color. At this point, I'll play around with the heat settings on the stove until it maintains the temperature that I'm looking for. When I get the frying pan dialed into the right temperature, I'll be able to bury the springs in the brass shavings. I want them below the surface because the top layer tends to be a little bit cooler than the layer just underneath the surface. So by burying the pieces, I'll get a good contact with all the shavings and they'll be at a constant temperature. And the whole time that the parts are in there, I'm taking a lot of temperature readings to make sure that the pan is sitting at the right temperature. The nice thing about doing it with this method is that you can leave the springs in there as long as you want, as long as you keep the frying pan at a constant temperature. They can't go above the temperature that you're aiming for. The final quench can be done in water. You're just cooling these pieces off so you can handle them. You're not changing the structure of the steel in any way, so you're not affecting the heat treating. If the forging and the heat treating were done correctly, this step shouldn't affect the piece in any way. Next I'm going to be sanding these back to bright metal, and I'll be ready to start assembling the lock. The first step in assembling the lock is to actually rivet the guides in position. This is kind of a nerve-wracking part of the process because once you start riveting things in place, that's where they're staying. So you do a lot of checking and double checking and make sure that you have all the clearances that you need so that when you actually rivet the guides in place, they're not going to jam up and cause a problem. I'm going to be clamping the guide block in the vise so I can trim the pegs down to the right length. Normally I would mark them with a Sharpie or something and cut them with a hacksaw, but these pegs are pretty heavy, so I'm going to be able to just use my angle grinder to grind them down to the right length. I'm going to rivet them with a small raising hammer that has a really narrow crosspeen. At first I'm just going to rivet them very lightly just to make sure that the guide block is well seated and locked in position. Then I'll check the fit with the bolt one last time, and then I'll come back and finish off the riveting. Now that the main guide block is in place, I need to insert the bolt before I can rivet the rear guide block. I have to make sure that this guide block works really well before riveting anything in place, because once this is in place, I can't take the bolt out to make any adjustments. And the rear bolt guide gets riveted in the same way I did the front bolt guide. So that's one bolt assembly installed, and I'll repeat the process for the other two bolts. Now that I have the bolt assemblies locked in position, I can start doing the final fitting of all the other parts. I'm going to start by bolting all the levers back in place. This will allow me to use the push rod to test the travel of all the bolts and make sure that I have everything working properly. On the initial test, something seems to be hanging up and preventing the bolts from opening fully, so I have to figure out where the problem is. I managed to narrow it down to the lever that opens the bolt on the left-hand side of the lock. The hole that I made at the end of the bolt is a little bit too small, and that's causing the lever to jam before it rotates all the way. So I need to figure out a way to get this lever to spin around another 5 degrees or so. Since the bolt is locked into the plate, I'm not going to be able to make any adjustments on it very easily. So I'm going to see if just thinning down the end of the lever will allow it to rotate just enough to open the bolt. I filed the end of the lever slightly, and I have it just set back in position, and it is rotating enough to allow the bolt to open fully, but now I have another problem. The push rod is a little bit too short and it's not meeting up with the lever. The simplest way to fix that is to just bend the top arm of the lever in slightly. By doing that, the bottom end of the lever will rotate over to the right and meet up with the push rod. Now I have everything reassembled and I'm ready to give it another test run. I'm just using a block as a guide right now to make sure that the push rod travels in a straight line. The last thing that I want to do today is figure out the location of the springs and cut the hole that I need to lock the springs in position. And here I just used a Sharpie to block in the areas where I'm going to need to scribe the location of each pin for the springs. Here I have the holes drilled out, and I'm going to be using a chisel to square up the holes the same way I did everything else. I'm using a chisel that's slightly narrower than the hole that I need, and I'm going to be sizing them up with needle files. They need to have a very snug fit to work well. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you have questions and you want to contact me directly, you can do so by emailing me at either one of the addresses that I have listed here. It may take me a couple of days, but I will get back to you. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.